Welcome, everyone. It is noon, so I will pass it off to Evelyn Nelson to get us started here today.
Super, thanks, Christy. I just want to welcome everyone to our Telehealth ROCKS Echo today. As many of you know, our Telehealth ROCKS program is a federally funded program that helps us extend telebehavioral health best practices to our schools and communities. We're fortunate today to present with our Keeping Kids Safe Echo around suicide prevention and awareness. I just have a few house cleaning things before we get rolling today. Just a reminder that the session's being recorded and we'll share that back with y'all afterwards. Your microphones have been muted, but we really, we love to hear your questions and ideas. So please do unmute and share. And then we also love to hear from you in the chat. Upon completion of today's session, we'll be sending out the certificates of participation. Please do make sure you've included your name. And I see that I think everybody has, that just helps us get the certificates out to you. So today we're fortunate to have Erica Mold joining us from Kansas Suicide Prevention Headquarters. And then in our chat, we also have Melissa Maris helping us in providing that clinical community psychologist perspective. Again, just a few reminders. We don't have any disclosures with our presenters today. And then with our mitigating bias, we're presenting the best information and recommendations that we have at this point in time. And then just a reminder, as I mentioned, we'll be sending out the recordings, the slides, and the certificates of attendance. We'd love to hear from you. So if you have any questions between now and our next session, please do reach out to Telehealth ROCKS at kumc.edu. So with that, I'll hand the baton to Erica and appreciate again your presentation today.
Thank you, Evelyn. All right. Hi again, everyone. I'm Erica Mold. I'm the Zero Suicide Program Coordinator at Ksphq, or Kansas Suicide Prevention Headquarters. As a recap, we have two main programs at Ksphq. One is the Kansas Suicide Prevention Resource Center, which is the side that I primarily work for. We do a lot of stuff like this, a lot of presentations to the community to help educate around suicide prevention, intervention, and postvention. So that also would include some suicide care policy consultation and development and postvention response. We also have Headquarters Counseling Center, which is our which is where we serve the whole state in a different way, in a more clinical way. We're answering 988 crisis contacts on the phone, on text, and on chat. We have a chat program that is specific to Kansas. And so our wait time is non-existent at this point. We also have a therapy clinic where I provide services, as well as folks who are master's level interns working in the School of Social Welfare usually. So we are able to provide some therapy to folks in our community in Lawrence. If you have any questions about our services, please feel free to ask. But for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. We're going to talk a little bit about why suicide screening in school. Oh, I guess I should introduce the topic for the day in general. We're talking about suicide screening and assessment in schools. Why is that important? Why is it important to have suicide screening in schools? Some KCTC data from 2019 tells us that in Kansas, students reported like 18.7% of students reported that they had thoughts of suicide at some point. Of those 9,700 students, 5,573 of them made an actual plan for suicide. And of those 5,573 students, 2,237 students made an attempt. There was this other small percentage of students, 313 students, made an attempt without a plan. So 313 of those 9,700 students made a suicide attempt without a plan. So this is information that we got from KCTC, or Kansas Communities That Care survey, which is a huge hot topic in the legislature right now and in schools, which I'll sort of talk about a little bit. But this is important, right? Because youth are reporting these numbers themselves, but they're not likely to reveal their suicidal thoughts without being asked directly. And also parents are less likely to know about suicidal thoughts or behaviors than the school is. So it's really important that we are willing and able to ask directly, because we have a lot of students who are thinking about suicide and even acting on their suicidal thoughts. Yes, thank you, Meg, for adding that. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I also just encourage everyone to kind of take a look at your KCTC data if you have it, so that you can get to know kind of what's going on in your specific community. So here's a word cloud. I don't want to belabor this too much because I know that a lot of you are very familiar with warning signs, but I do like to think about warning signs in a little bit of a different way. Before I dive into how I like to think about warning signs, I'd like to hear from you all. What are some of the warning signs that you're seeing in your schools that students are showing as warning signs for suicide, or just warning signs that you are aware of? So if you want to go ahead and click the link in the chat to respond to the word cloud. So we're seeing things like hopelessness, not knowing what's wrong, changes in hygiene, lots of crying, feeling isolated or being isolated, withdrawing, apathy. Was that falling asleep maybe in class? That's a big one, yeah. Seeing lots of these, changes in sleep, lack of connection to an adult at school, or just lack of connection in general, is also true. Yeah. These are great. Withdrawing. Thank you all. Being distant, bullying or being bullied. Mm-hmm. And bullying is something that can create mental health crises, right? So, well, we can talk more about that if we need to, but I think that's pretty awesome. Thank you for participating. And these are all really good. A lot of, you'll notice that the things that we're seeing on this word cloud are definitely represented in the ways in the following slides, in the ways that we like to think about warning signs. Okay, whenever this is finished, yeah, okay. So what do we look for, right? What are we supposed to be looking for that can help us understand that we need to screen now, right? So how do we know when a screening is appropriate? And the answer to that is you've observed warning signs, or someone has directly reported to you that someone is suicidal. So Thomas Joyner is a suicidologist who created his theory of suicidal behavior, his interpersonal theory of suicidal behavior. And the way that he thinks about what's kind of the recipe for a higher risk for a suicide attempt. And one of the things that he talks about is this idea of perceived burdensomeness. So we all know that that we're all capable of feeling like a burden. What we also need to understand is that someone who feels like a burden doesn't necessarily have to be actually a burden, right? So it's about this perception of burdensomeness. When we are sick, when we're struggling with mental health issues, it is really common for people to feel like a burden, even if someone isn't telling them that they're a burden, even if nobody is giving them a signal that they are being burdensome. And so it's similar to, we hear a lot of times suicide is selfish, and it's okay to feel that way. It's okay to feel angry about someone who makes an attempt or losing someone to suicide. Just like we talked about last week, any feelings that we have around a suicide loss are okay and normal. But I think it's helpful to understand too that almost everyone I've ever talked to about suicide who is feeling suicidal, and me myself as a suicide attempt survivor, I always felt like I would be doing the people in my life a favor if I were to die, because that feeling of burdensomeness was so strong. And that's something that we hear a lot of the time. My friends are tired of hearing about my struggles. My family doesn't get it, and I don't want to make them feel worried. Those kinds of things are indicators that this person is struggling with the perception that they're a burden. And so when that experience is paired with this experience of low belonging or social alienation, those two things together can create a desire for suicide. And I want to talk a second about low belonging and social alienation, because I view them as really related things, but two separate things as well. So social alienation is often something that we can see. If you walk down the hallways of your high school or your school in general, you might notice that there are students who are on the outskirts, who don't have as many friends, who aren't engaging with peers, who are really just kind of keeping to themselves. Maybe they're being bullied, maybe they're being ostracized for some reason. But that is that social alienation piece. But low belonging is not something that you can observe. I was a person who was a very high achieving student always. I was on every sports team, in every club, and I was perceived as someone who had a lot of friends and was quote unquote popular. But I never felt like I belonged anywhere in my education experience, especially until I was in college. And so that experience of low belonging is totally wrapped in shame, feeling like we can't actually show up as ourselves without being judged, or at least there's this fear that we will be judged. And so that is an internal experience, not something that can always be observed by an external party. And so it's important to kind of keep in mind that just because someone isn't being bullied or someone has a lot of friends, that doesn't mean that they're safe from suicide. It's important that we're looking for other warning signs, and we're not just focusing on the students who are having these other socially alienated experiences. So all of those experiences are important. When we have a desire for suicide and we pair that with this idea of acquired capability, that's going to really increase the risk for a suicide attempt to occur. Acquired capability is, yes, having access to lethal means, that's part of it, but it's more so an understanding of somebody's fear and pain threshold. So when we know that there's a student who's engaging in self-harm, for instance, or who regularly engages in self-harm, that doesn't necessarily mean that that student is suicidal, because we know that self-harm is actually different from suicide. It's not the same thing. Self-harm is a coping mechanism. The intention is to sustain and keep living. Whereas suicide, the intention is to die, right? Suicidal behavior. But because someone has that regular experience of physically harming their bodies, their fear and pain threshold looks different than someone who doesn't have that experience. So they're going to be more likely or more willing to harm their bodies in a suicide attempt than somebody who doesn't engage in self-harm. Their fear and pain threshold is going to look different. So it's like, how afraid is this person of dying? And how afraid are they of pain? So that's what acquired capability looks like, is as well. So all of those things together can increase the risk for suicide. So that's kind of a higher level overview of what kind of warning signs to look out for. Another way, go ahead to the next slide, please. Another way that we conceptualize warning signs are in these three categories: loss, pain, and gut instinct. I'm not going to spend too much time diving in because the information is on the slide and you all will receive a copy of these. So just know that loss, any experience of loss or that's related to loss can be a warning sign for suicide. Any expression or avoidance of pain, those, and whether that's psychological pain or physical pain, those things can be a warning sign for suicide. And if you have a feeling in your gut that someone's not okay, that could be a warning sign for suicide. So we want to make sure that we're listening to that. So really what this comes down to are signs of struggle. If someone is struggling with something and we know that that's true, or we think that might be true, it's a good idea to ask about suicide. The best case scenario is that we ask about suicide and the person says, no, I'm not thinking about suicide, I'm just struggling. So that's kind of how I like to think about warning signs, and we at KSPHQ like to think about warning signs as just signs of struggle. And if someone's struggling, it's okay to ask about suicide. Go ahead and go to the next slide. Checking the time here. Then there's a separation between general warning signs and imminent warning signs. I should say also that if we notice a sign of struggle, that doesn't automatically mean that someone is thinking about suicide. People exhibit warning signs for suicide all of the time because warning signs for suicide are shared with other issues, right? So again, just because we ask someone about suicide doesn't mean that they're automatically thinking about suicide, doesn't mean that they're going to start thinking about suicide. These are just things to look out for. And if we want to be as safe as we can be, then asking is a no harm question. Then there are things called imminent warning signs, where someone might be talking or writing about suicide or death or a desire to disappear. And that can take the form of like attention seeking behavior. That can take the form of social media posts, and it can also take the form of jokes. And so even if we're seeing these things and we might have this bias in our minds of like, oh, that person's just, they say that all the time, they're just doing that for attention. People are seeking attention because they probably need some attention. So let's go ahead and give them the attention they need. We like to say people who are seeking attention are actually seeking connection. And so there's a need that's not being met. Let's go ahead and figure out what that is. We want to make sure that we're taking all jokes and all comments or indicators of suicide seriously. If somebody has a plan or intent to act on that plan, that is an imminent warning sign. And what imminent warning signs mean is just that an intervention needs to happen right away. So we need to have more information immediately. A screening needs to be taking place right now. And we need to know what we're going to do at the end of that screening as well, based on the outcome of that screening. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Since you all, again, you have this information, you can look over it for imminent warning signs later on. But I know that there was, somebody had brought up, or we're actually, sorry, we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about a scenario later where sometimes students will say that they're suicidal in a moment of dysregulation, and that's not actually they're not actually suicidal in that moment. So we're going to talk about that. Let's talk about how we get answers that we really need from students. When we think that somebody might be at risk for suicide, we need the information and we need it to be really accurate. And so what that takes is an environment where a student feels safe being able to disclose honestly if they are thinking about suicide. So for us, that as the screener, that looks like asking direct and specific questions that are not leading. So that's the difference between, are you thinking about suicide or are you thinking about killing yourself, versus you're not thinking about suicide, are you? One of those is leading, right? The second one is a very leading question. And what we're communicating to the person is that we need the answer to be no. Or we might have the experience of asking, are you thinking about suicide? And then when we want to know about a person's intention, do you have intent to kill yourself? We might say instead, well, you wouldn't really do that, would you? And again, that's communicating to a person that we don't want the answer to be yes. We don't feel comfortable with their suicidality. And we want to make sure that we are not communicating that we're not sending that message. So again, really direct and specific questions that are not leading. Sometimes this means that we have to explain why we're asking this question. And I am in the habit of explaining every time, especially if this is a new person that I'm working with. So explain why you're asking. I want to know if you're thinking about suicide, or I need to ask you these questions because I want to make sure that you're safe. Your safety is really important to me. And just so you know, if you are suicidal, here's what you can expect from me if I learn that you're suicidal. You can expect that I will have to have a conversation with your parents. You can expect that you will not be in trouble with the school. You can expect that you're not going to be immediately taken to the hospital or into police custody. There are certain situations where going to the hospital might be on the table as an option, but that's pretty rare. So if being able to explain those things to students, they really, really appreciate transparency. And they're much more likely to be honest with you if you're able to be transparent with them. And then obviously being able to validate the student's feelings and navigate a conversation without judgment. I can tell you that people can be suicidal for literally any reason. And especially when we're working with young people whose brains aren't fully developed, those reasons can feel really surprising. For me, if somebody would have asked me why I tried to kill myself when I was 15, I would have said at the time, because I had a really bad basketball practice. And if, like, looking back on that now, that reason is so bizarre, I guess, because I played basketball my whole life. How many bad basketball practices had I had in my life? So many. Why was that one different? Well, that one was different because I was going through a lot of other stuff at the time, and it was just the last straw for me. But I didn't know that because I was 15 and I didn't have the capacity to understand my experience fully at that time. So remembering that the impulsivity of kids and teenagers is really high, and their ability to regulate their emotions or rationalize is really low compared to the ability of healthy adults, right? So that's why it's so important that we are approaching these conversations with total non-judgment. Really just being able to say, I'm okay with whatever it is that you share with me. And I'm not judging you. Just being able to be transparent and then actually follow up with statements that aren't judgmental. Like, it sounds like you're feeling really defeated because you had a bad basketball practice and that's making you think about suicide. You know, like, just being able to say things like that can go a long way. When we think about asking direct and specific questions, I recommend, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I recommend utilizing a formalized screening tool because we aren't all taught how to ask those direct and specific questions. We aren't all taught, we don't all have those things memorized. What's the right question to ask in the right order? And how do I ask it in language that is objective and not judgmental and not leading? I recommend, and our agency recommends, utilizing the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. I know that a lot of schools are already doing this. And so if you aren't already doing this, I highly recommend at least checking it out and seeing if this might be something that you could implement in your school. The reason that we recommend this training or this screening tool is because the direct and specific questions are already written. They're there for you. All you have to do is read them. And I know that often the fear around that is, well, I don't want to sound robotic. And that my response to that is you can be compassionate and you can be a human being while also utilizing a screening tool. You just tell the student, hey, I'm using this particular piece of paper because it has the questions on there and I want to make sure I'm asking questions in the right way because your safety, again, is the most important thing to me. So being able to just explain that, kids are okay with that. If you utilize the Columbia, sorry, I just got distracted by the chat and I'm going to come back to that because I have to read for context. If you use the CSSRS, it also has recommended steps to take based on the risk level. So there are 3 or 4 actually risk outcomes. And there are specific steps that are recommended based on each level. So, and then you can also explain that to a student. Well, it looks to me like you are thinking about suicide, but really you're at a low risk for suicide. So that means we obviously still have to have a conversation with your parents, but we don't have to send you to the hospital, right? We don't have to take an emergency intervention. All we have to do is think about safety, and let's talk about safety planning. Kind of similar with the moderate risk level. And then with high risk, there's some different recommendations. So if someone's at high risk for suicide, it does recommend that we go ahead and go to the hospital to get a full screening and assessment done, to see if the hospital is something that would be important in an important intervention. So there are, like I said, recommendations that are created by suicide prevention experts. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You just have to say, this is best practice, and this is what our school needs to do. And there is a specific Columbia suicide severity rating scale for schools. So that is included in the packet that you'll receive after the presentation today, which also includes a lot of information about suicide intervention in schools. And if you don't already have, this is my next point, if you don't already have a suicide intervention policy in place at your school, you should have one. And if you need one, Christy will be sending a sample policy from Ksphq for you all to look at, which includes screening, and particularly includes the Columbia. And in that packet, when you look at the Columbia, it looks really long, and that's only because I included alternate language for students who are really young, so very young children or cognitively impaired kids. So there's different language for each question, and that's what makes it longer. So you are most likely to use just the first question, the first set of questions for each point, which the Columbia is only 3 to 6 questions. We always ask questions 1, 2, and 6. And if we need to, we ask 3, 4, and 5. So I do recommend having some training around the Columbia if you choose to use it. And we do offer that at Ksphq for free. So I can, if folks are interested in that, I can send some resources along. The other thing that the Columbia does is that's different from other screening tools is that it asks specifically about suicidal thoughts and suicidal behaviors, which are super important because a lot of times there are students who are having suicidal behaviors that aren't necessarily thinking about suicide all the time. Maybe they're engaging in some risky behaviors or risk-taking behaviors that they didn't contextualize as suicidal behaviors. So it's really important to know about thoughts and behaviors to get a full understanding of a person's risk. And the Columbia is really intentional about that. And that's different from really any other screening tool out there. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Just to quickly touch on House Bill 2567 and the implications for suicide screening. There's a lot of questions about, okay, well, we were doing it this way, but now it's written into the bill that we have to contact parents before asking any questions about suicide. That's just one part of this bill. We tried to get formal guidance on that particular part so that we could share that with you all today. And we didn't really get a lot of helpful information. Essentially, what we were told is that each individual school district just needs to contact their legal team for interpretation and formal guidance on how your school district wants to navigate that. So I would love to hear, if we have time, maybe towards the end, I would love to hear how you all are navigating that, because I think a lot of school districts are doing it differently. I know that Baldwin, the folks who were here last week who shared their postvention experience, the way that they're navigating that is that if they get a disclosure from a credible source that someone is suicidal, then they contact parents before making contact with that student and asking about suicide. If they're having a conversation with a student who they suspect is at risk of suicide, they don't break that conversation or interrupt that conversation to contact parents. They go ahead and ask questions, and then they contact parents after to let them know that happened. So that's how their school district is interpreting this bill. But again, it could be different. So it's just important to talk to your legal team about that. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, so now is the time where we can talk about scenarios. I'm gonna maybe leave it up to you all. It looks like there's a lot of questions in the chat. Should I attend to that?
Erica, just checking in. I think a lot of the questions in the chat are more logistics of contact and those pieces that Christy is addressing.
Okay.
So I don't think we've missed anything.
Awesome.
Except I did want to highlight our friend Lydia, who was commenting on how after doing trainings in this topic, that they are asking a lot more questions and being more direct after these trainings. So just wanted to highlight that as a success and something to celebrate.
Yes, and I'm seeing too that the students have acted relieved that someone's asking them, and that is absolutely most often the response. A lot of people will be relieved that someone is asking directly, because then it's this experience of like, oh, you're willing to have this conversation with me, cool. Because potentially nobody else in their life is willing to have that conversation except for maybe their peers, which is great to have that peer support, but also, we need adult intervention for kids. So that's awesome, Lydia. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so should we go ahead and introduce the scenario? So Megan Hewitt is here with us from, actually, I don't know what school district because I didn't keep track.
Junction City, 475. Gary County.
Perfect.
Yeah, you've done trainings with us.
Yes, awesome. Welcome. So Megan, do you want to go ahead and just kind of talk about the scenario that you had brought
Sure.
up? And cool.
Sure. So I certainly want to preface that I'm in an elementary school setting. And so Erica's comments earlier about just the age or the maturity level that we deal with. I mean, I definitely take that into consideration, but it seems to be more prominent last year, especially just about when a student gets upset or something has occurred, that their first reaction is pretty, extreme or a cry for help, and using words like killing or dying, referring to themselves. And so as a whole school, this is my 5th year in this building, and I really feel like as a whole, we do a good job of teaching the self-regulation skills and having a calm area in the classroom and having a break area that's even in a whole different part of our building. And the students understanding that these are the options available to them at all times. But then when I am involved or made aware of the situation and talk with the student, unfortunately, more times than not, the scenario kind of escalates before it de-escalates, because when I do bring up the concern about their safety and well-being and contacting parents, which again, in certain situations, that might be part of the issue, but they get even more dysregulated. because they don't have an understanding of why parents would need to be made aware, or the adults in their world. Even though when I first go into the classrooms at the very beginning of the school year, you know, we talk about my obligation as a mandated reporter in a variety of situations. So I really feel like the skills in a very broad sense are there for the self-regulation, but also helping them to better understand that these words do have a big meaning behind them, and we're going to take them seriously every time, even if it's just a bad day, a bad moment. So I was just curious too, in bringing this scenario to the group, just if this is something that other people incur, and then what strategies, because I do see it as a continual issue at a young age, like hopefully trying to get them the skills they need at a younger age so that they're better prepared for middle school and high school and life in general.
Thank you for sharing. Like we said in the chat, this is a really common thing that we get, which hopefully is validating, but also doesn't necessarily help. So I think maybe first, if there is anyone in the group who wants to speak to this, I'll go ahead and step back, because I don't want to like I don't want to take up too much space. But I will, and maybe Melissa can also speak to this if nobody else, or when other people are done.
And one other just question I have for the group too would be, when you have contacted parents, especially with the elementary school age students, how to make it an important thing for the parents, and not just say, oh, I've gotten the response, well, they say this all the time at home. Okay, well, that's not a good thing. Like, that needs to be addressed. Or they say they will, you know, be involved, or, you know, take it seriously, but then the follow through is little to none. If there's any strategies or helpful hints on that too.
So it sounds like Christina is suggesting a follow-up question just to clarify. You know, so you said you're going to kill yourself. What does that mean? And kind of asking for more information. I love this strategy. I often say that, you know, when you don't know what else to say, remembering "tell me more" as those 3 words. So tell me more. Even if you have no idea what the person just said, tell me more. And usually someone will say more words, and then you can start to piece something together. But just to clarify kind of what that means, and if it's a connection to something that might be of more significant concern, or if it's just kind of something they say because they've heard it in a movie or something their friends say, and just to try to get more information, and then following up to explain the difference. Thanks, Christina. I appreciate that.
So first, I just want to say that this is exhausting for school social workers and counselors, because if this is happening regularly, what I will say, I mean, is that it's important that you're taking it seriously, which you know, and that's what you continue to do, which is exhausting because if the risk is actually pretty low, but you have to essentially go through the motions every time. It takes a lot of capacity. So I want to validate that. I also think that kind of my approach to navigating this, I guess, would be to, you know, I take this as a warning sign. If you're saying these words to me, I'm going to do a screening. And I'm going to go through, the whole screening as you do. And I'm going to ask for lots of clarification without leading a student to, to bend their answers to my will. I want to know the accurate information. I'm going to explain why I need to know this information. Usually I'll say, like, it sounds like you're in a lot of pain right now, or that you're really frustrated, or like you said up here, upset. And so, but you're also saying these words about killing yourself, and that means I have to ask you some questions. Do you think that, we could get to a place where I can ask you these questions? Because if a student is really escalated, it might not be my first move to go right into a screening. I might actually just take some time to help them regulate their emotions, co-regulate with them, and do whatever needs to happen before even kind of addressing the suicide of it all. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I think being able to help them get to a place that's a little calmer before even bringing up the need to talk to parents, or before asking more questions about suicide. Obviously, don't ignore the statements. But I don't know that you'll get a lot of accurate information until the student is a little more calm. So that would be my first kind of recommendation, is to work with the student to regulate those emotions, even if that takes a little while, and then follow that up with a screening, and explain why you have to do a screening, even if you've done this many times. Kind of understand what their true risk level is. If it's low, or if they say, I'm not actually suicidal, I was just saying that in the moment, being able to say, I just need you to know that every time you tell me that, I'm going to take it seriously. That's essentially the consequence of you saying that. And so I don't know that there can be other consequences, and I'll be curious what you all think about that. But to me, a student saying that they're going to kill themselves or that they want to die, over and over again, even if that's not true, the consequence to that behavior is that they're going to be screened and their parents are going to be contacted. I mean, I don't know what else you can do, because you have to take it seriously. We can, kind of in an ongoing way, work with them, continue to work with them on, in the moment that you're frustrated, is this the thing that you really want to say? Or are there other words that you might be able to use to get that feeling out, and to express whatever it is that's going on? And I'm sure that's something that you all are already doing. So it's just really hard, but and kind of time consuming. But I think the consequences of this behavior for the student are that you're going to take it seriously every time, and that you're going to have to contact parents, even if their risk is really low. But I will remind everyone in this moment that when we're most exhausted, right, when we've worked with the same student over and over again who says these words in a moment of frustration or escalation, we still have to go through the motions, because there is always the possibility that a student could meet at this time, and that they could be at a higher risk than they're normally at in this moment. And so, just kind of keeping that in mind as a reason to keep going, and kind of staying grounded in, like, just because somebody says this all the time doesn't mean it's not true this time, if that makes sense. Melissa, you unmuted. Were you going to say something?
So I was just kind of to echo what Erica said, Megan, just to validate that this is very, very common. And it's one of the primary concerns that folks bring up when we start talking about having these conversations and asking these direct questions, is, so what do we do when, this terminology is thrown around all the time, and how do we address it? And so there's a little bit of kind of bad news, good news. So the bad news is that this is a culture shift. It requires a shift in the language we use, and it means changing the way that people use words. And so that's what you're speaking of when you say that you're following up with parents and caregivers, and they're saying, well, they use that all the time here, right? So this is a big shift. It sounds like, and usually when folks who are in your position and others who are on this call, when you start to really feel the weight of that in terms of just the amount of time it takes, that usually means like you're riding the wave of that shift. So the good news is that it does shift. And I've seen this in a whole bunch of schools that eventually, if you take it seriously every single time and you kind of follow a very consistent and predictable pattern of what you're going to do, that every grown-up in the school takes it seriously. If you can coach, kind of as Erica was saying, around different words to use. So I'm going to kill myself. So are you mad? Are you frustrated? Are you disappointed? Like, let's work on some kind of emotional literacy kind of language. Let's expand the vocabulary so that we know that there are other options, but that still every time this comes up that we are going to take it seriously because we care. And that's what we do when we care, because the alternative also kind of stinks. That so if we don't respond, what that's communicating is worse than what we have to do when we are responding. And that you really do see this shift. And what I would point out is that, 15, 20 years ago, it was not at all uncommon for young people in schools to talk often about getting guns and committing acts of violence in schools. I'm going to get a gun and shoot up the school. That was not something that was terribly uncommon to hear. And it's not something that we hear now. And the reason why is because there's been a shift in the language we use. And we began taking that language very seriously. We shifted the culture, and now we have a different approach to that language. And so just kind of, we don't want to punish folks from disclosing that they are having hard feelings and that they might be suicidal. And we want them to know that we believe them, we hear them, we trust their words, we trust them no matter how old they are. And we're going to take it seriously because that's what they deserve. And then we're going to do that every time. But do know, again, if you hang in there and stick with it, it will get better in terms of being able to, you'll see the shift in the language. A big piece of it is making sure that teachers, paras, your non-certified staff, so folks who are working in the cafeteria, and your custodial staff, bus drivers, that everybody kind of knows this is what we're doing now. If we hear these words, this is what happens, because that's also part of it, is just making it super duper consistent and predictable. That helps everybody feel safer, because the kid sitting next to the young friend who says something like this is also watching and listening, and they want to see how the grownups are going to respond. It helps them feel safer to know that, okay, grownups are going to respond. This is a grown-up thing to handle. It's not me as a fourth grader who needs to handle this. The grownups are going to step in. They know what to do. They're going to help keep my friends safe, and they'll help keep me safe every single time. And so again, there is no easy magic anything with this, but it is worth it to stick with it. It does get better over time.
Yeah, that's really helpful, Melissa. Thank you for, I really love the way that you explained that. So thank you for chiming in for sure. You asked a kind of a second part of the question was about how do we then, like, when we do take it seriously, because that's what we're doing, then how do we work with parents? I will say that either next week or the week after, I'm assuming it'll be next week, our topic is going to be around safety planning and working with parents. So we're going to dive in a lot more into that question. But for today, I'll just say that it's not always easy. And I have worked with a lot of parents who are so tired that they just maybe don't have the capacity in that moment to take it seriously. Or it's a really vulnerable thing for them to hear that their child is talking like this. And so they don't want it to be true. And so that's why they dismiss it. It's more of this like internal process of like, oh, that can't be true. Not my kid, So even when we're tired, being able to approach the parent with a lot of compassion and being able to kind of validate how tired or how tiresome this is, while also insisting that it be taken seriously, while also in your mind understanding that you can't force parents to do anything. You can make really strong recommendations, and you can be direct about those recommendations and about how serious the school is taking this. But unless, you know, this child is at really high risk and the parent is neglecting that, we can't do anything about that. It's not reportable necessarily. So being able to remember like what your role is in that moment, and while we really want sometimes to be able to like convince parents or control parents and have them do the thing that needs to be done, we don't always have that power, and that can be hard to sit with. So being able to just kind of validate yourself and the rest of your staff around that difficulty, I think, is important. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I am a huge advocate for very clear policies and procedures. If that is not a thing that you've learned from me after last week and this week, based on the handouts that you receive, it's really important to me that schools do have policies and procedures, and that everyone in the school community, which includes parents, students, teachers, staff, is aware of what that policy and procedure is. So I just echo what Melissa said in the chat. And if you don't have a school policy, or you don't know what it should look like, or you feel like maybe yours should be reviewed, look out for the attachment that will be coming your way after this presentation, because it walks you through all of those things. And it also includes a parent acknowledgement form, which is super important to facilitate as a conversation. You can say, here are the things that the school has recommended the parent do based on this child's screening, suicide risk screening. And these are the things that the parent agreed to do or did not agree to do. And then the parent has to sign that as well. So that kind of can put some perspective when they see it in writing, and they see like, oh, I have to sign my name to this. It can feel a little bit more serious, I guess, in that moment. Does anyone have other questions or anything related to this scenario? Let's go ahead and go to the takeaways slide. So, you know, just to recap, I think it's really important that everyone in the school understands and is familiar with warning signs of suicide, and that they know what their role is when they recognize a warning sign for suicide. So it might mean that a teacher is noticing some warning signs, and maybe their role is to let a school social worker or counselor know, hey, this student might be at risk, can you screen them? And so not every person in the school is going to be responsible for screening students for suicide, right? So making sure that they know who to report to when they're worried about a student, and that they know what those steps are and what they look like. And then, you know, just to reiterate, having a suicide prevention policy, it should say actually suicide intervention policy and plan in place for the school building is critical. If nobody has any questions, that's all I have. So I'll hand it back over to Christy.
Sounds good. Thanks, Erica. We will be sending you an email full of information. It will have the key takeaways. It will have the PDF that Erica mentioned. And we look forward to seeing everybody next week on, let's see, Tuesday, October 18th at noon. And if anyone is having trouble receiving any of the emails, if you just email us at Telehealth ROCKS, Melissa just put it in the chat, B, will make sure that you are on the email list, we've got your email correct, and that we can send you any of the previous ones too, so everybody's in the loop. All right.
One thing I'll
And-
add too is that last week someone had requested like an editable version of the PDF that was shared. If anyone needs that, that's easy to send out. So just, I guess, reach out to Christy and I'll make sure that she has an editable version if folks are hoping to utilize the policy that we're sending out.
Sounds good. Yep. Just let us know at that Telehealth ROCKS email. And then if anybody has a scenario like Megan shared today that has to do with safety planning or working with parents, if you email us, we can add that to the presentation. You can get some recommendations. I typed up everything that everybody said. Erica will go over and then we will send that to Megan so that she didn't have to variously take notes during this session, and she'll have everything that we have. And, you know, if there are some things that we forgot, we'll add that in too. So if you want to share a scenario, you can get recommendations and we'll send it to you afterwards.